Let's face it, Yu-Gi-Oh is a very difficult card game. In fact, it might be the most difficult card game in the entire world. And while it's not the only card game to have a very steep learning curve, it might be the only card game to have a learning wall. To illustrate my point, I would like to introduce you to Patient Zero, Rarin, a professional Hearthstone player who recently took on the quest that is playing Yu-Gi-Oh for 10 hours. His goal was to prove how ridiculous the game was, and he succeeded. He even made a condensed summary reflection video that prompted me to make this one. And to quote the man himself,
From an outsider's perspective, Yu-Gi-Oh seems like the most ridiculous card game that exists.
I really couldn't have said it any better. This game is crazy, and that really leads some to ask, why? Why is this game so complicated? Why don't my cards do anything? Why the BA no die? All questions I'd like to try and take on headfirst today, or maybe days. I don't know how long this is going to take for me to make. To start, let's tackle what makes this game so complicated first. The first layer of complication are the cards themselves. Neither Yu-Gi-Oh player's hand nor deck are abnormally large. In fact, almost all Yu-Gi-Oh decks are smaller than Magic or Pokemon decks. Part of the problem is the card text. I'm not the first to say this, and I won't be the last, but Yu-Gi-Oh cards have a lot of words. A lot of unnecessary words at that. Let's take a look at Cashier Fenrir, for example. This card has relatively few words compared to some other cards that I could choose, yet it still has many of the same problems. At a first glance, could you tell me how many effects this card has? I'll give you a second to figure it out. There are two effects. Along with those effects are a summoning condition, a hard once per turn clause, more on this later, for both effects, and a restriction on one of the effects. But I only know all this because I've been no-lifing this game for at least the last half year, and I've been playing for much longer. There are many places a new player could get confused with when looking at Cashier Fenrir. The first issue is identifying the summoning condition in the first place. If you didn't know that's how it worked, would you know that that was a summoning condition? Next comes with identifying the effects, which while doing so, they're likely to make the mistake of considering the attack declaration, target vanish one face down, and the when your opponent activates a monster effect, target one vanish face down, as two entirely separate effects with a different once per turn clause. And that leads me to the next point of complication, and that is how the cards interact with each other. At the start of every new set, I get two feelings: excitement and dread. There's so many new cards I could add to my deck, and there's so many new cards they could add to their deck. As a new player, you only really have one of these feelings because you don't know what any of the cards do. And that's one of the biggest points of tension as a new player. I mean, I think back to my introduction to this game, and I enjoyed it because my friends were there, but there was nothing more frustrating than thinking you used the card right just to find out it never mattered. And that's how it feels as a new player with, like, every card. I mean, there are just so many cards that you need to know. First, you need to know the 40 cards that make up your main deck, and then you need to figure out what the 15 cards in your extra deck do. And then you need to know the combo lines for the deck, for your actual deck, so that your cards actually do something. And you have to memorize these lines, by the way. It's something that we often take for granted as like actually experienced players, that we have these combos memorized. But getting into the game or even learning a new deck, you can get this feeling where not knowing the combos feels so horrible. You're just sitting there reading the card where your opponent's comboing off, and then it gets to your turn and you still don't know what to do. After all that, the new player has a chance to like maybe try and figure out what their opponent's deck does, but they don't even know what theirs does. I mean, think about it. It takes hours to learn a new deck, and that's with all the resources in the world to help you out. Combo videos, your friends giving you advice, deck profiles. Now, imagine instead of having all of those resources, what you have is a 15-minute turn where your opponent occasionally utters the phrases, special summon, summon from deck, effect search, and that's all you have to work off of. That's basically the new player experience, and it's kind of a wall. The next hurdle to be leapt is just how unintuitive the game really is. There are only a few effect types that you'll see on a duel-to-duel basis: triggers, ignitions, continuous, lingerings being the main ones. That being said, the way they interact sometimes makes no sense. For example, when you use the graveyard effect of Eldritch the Golden Lord to add him to your hand and then summon him, which gives him a stat bonus, it would make sense for effect failure to make him lose that attack gain, since it negates the Eldritch, but it doesn't. The game mechanic behind this is that the Eldritch in Graveyard and the Eldritch that are summoned are two different effects, since when Eldritch is added to hand, it's now private game knowledge, and we now no longer know if it's the same card. But to a new player, why would that make sense? I mean, it barely makes sense to current players who play every day. I mean, it is literally the same physical card. And that's not the only weird interaction of effects. I mean, look at continuous and field spells. The age-old adage is that MST doesn't negate, but in this case it does. If your opponent uses a continuous spell or activates a field spell and you chain a MST or a Ghost Ogre that destroys it, it essentially negates. And don't get me started on, well, it fizzles or it resolves without effect, because why does it work like that? You know? My point of all this is that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is really convoluted, and it has a lot of very odd quirks and makes it very hard to learn. I mean, I for one have come to love them, but I can see how these quirks make the game so hard to learn. All of this to say that Yu-Gi-Oh!, while it's very skill expressive and has a lot of skill expression through deck construction, plays that you make, and all this other stupid stuff that I love, I can see how it makes it functionally impossible for new players to learn the game. I mean, I personally would love to see this game go on for another decade, 2 decades, and so long that I can have my future children learning this game and loving it. But as things are, that probably won't happen. Training wheels, often used by literal toddlers, are actually very useful. I mean, when I was a young boy, they certainly prevented me from many scrapes and bruises, as well as accelerated how fast I learned how to bike. So how does this relate to Yu-Gi-Oh!, I hear you asking? Well, hold on and I'll explain. Konami, the owner of Yu-Gi-Oh!, is this great game, a tool really, called Master Duel. It has a great reach and lowers the barrier of entry for Yu-Gi-Oh! Sounds great for new players, doesn't it? Well, you're dead wrong. Despite all that it has going for it, Master Duel has likely turned away millions of new players, if recent meetings held by the Konami investors are any indication of its success. But Master Duel could become the training wheels that it needs to be. See, I told you I'd come back around. Because of its easy access, Master Duel could become a ground for new players to breed and come into their own, if not for this one problem. Its format. It's too much like the TCG and OCG formats for its own good. I'm fairly certain that Konami sees Master Duel as its attempt to curb the online duel simulator market, but it really should be a place for new players instead, so they can learn the game in a safer place. If Master Duel had a format that was much lower in power and held different rules, the card game could actually help bridge the gap between the new players and veteran Yu-Gi-Oh! Players. Back to the wall analogy, the skill wall is so steep because of the format that the TCG and OCG respectively have. It hasn't changed since the dawn of the card game itself, outside of the occasional ban list that comes without any warning or communication to the community from Konami. And there are a lot of cards that can be used at any one time. Not only that, in any format there are many decks that use more than one archetype for their game plan. Look at the runic sprite lists as of late for an example. These two features come together to make sometimes much too complicated. Holy fuck, okay. These two features come together to make some much too what the These two features come together to make something much too complicated to really understand without throwing away your life for hours, days, even months. So what can Konami do about this? Well, they could use Master Duel as a curated format, one that is lower in power and has a limited card pool. That way it's not nearly as overbearing for someone new to the game and, in fact, may help them grow. I mean, look towards MVT, he's doing something very similar to this, and I imagine it'd be very helpful for new players. That being said, I don't really see Konami looking towards this, despite how useful it could be in even using just alternate formats on Master Duel. So what can we as the community do instead, since we can't rely on Konami to help them? As much as it shouldn't need to be the case, we can all be guides toward the development of new players. But this starts by not being very condescending online. Something that I saw recently was in a response that Rarin made to the Farfa reaction to the Rarin video. I know, it's real meta now. The discourse got heated despite the fact they weren't talking to each other. It got very emotional because... And listen, I love Farfa, but his video was definitely a piss taker, you know? He was looking at the Rarin reaction, or the reflection that he put up, about having played Yu-Gi-Oh! And it was just like, haha, I can't believe this new player didn't know how to do the combo right. And it's like, Well, yeah, it is kind of funny, but that doesn't help bring new players to the game if that's how we're going to act. And so we really should try and have a nurturing way to help them. And like, it sucks to be a new player too, because you don't want to have to look to your friends or those around you to tell you how to play the game, but it's kind of what we need to do. So as a community, if we want to keep this game going, we should probably try and be a little more, accepting and kind, and a lot less condescending, especially in Twitch chats and stuff. Otherwise, we're just going to drive away more players, and, well, no more players, no more tournaments. So there are two things I would like you guys to really take away from this video. The first is that this game is hard enough as it is, especially as a new player. And so something we as a community need to change is our reputation. Currently, we are known as condescending, like, higher than thou types, and, well, that's not very conducive for gaining new players. So it would be really great if we could turn our community to a more accepting and inviting community, so that while new players learn how to play the game, we're here offering help and support, not just saying, "Aha, aha, he went -3 for 2 kitchens." No flame on you, Farfa. It is funny, but like it's not very conducive for a very healthy community. And second, I would love to see, and I don't know how I would be able to do this, but this is something I would love to see done more often, even at local tournaments. I would love to see community support for a more beginner-friendly format, something a lot like the rotation series that MBT is starting to put out, where the decks are very neutered, almost entirely constructed. In fact, them being constructed is probably very useful. And so it's a format that new players could just hop into. They'd have to read the cards, obviously, but you're faced with a deck of 40 cards, and that deck of 40 cards puts up a negate and has 2 dead cards at the end of the turn, not 4 negates with 3 hand traps and half the deck in the graveyard. That would probably be very helpful for a new player. All that being said, see you later, guys. Keep on cooking.